much, Richard. Hello, everybody. I miss not being there with you. It's a pity, but a lot is going on. I just, for the people who are joining us from the outside of the project, maybe just very quickly a few words of introduction. This is a event of one of the two projects we are running. One is Fatigue, the other one is Pop Rebel. I, together with Professor Moll, I am the PI on those projects, and in case of Fatigue, I am the scientist in charge. This is a project that has in it 15 doctoral students who are now very advanced in their work, and it is a consortium of several universities led by UCL, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And we are very grateful for a generous support for those projects from the European Commission, from the Horizon 2020 grant. I started thinking about this project, I think, around 2017. I was trying to recover my memory. I know that we had initial events for Fatigue. The initial event was in August 2018. And then we started Pop Rebel into January 2019. In the meantime, there were a few events, and they are going on. In the worst nightmare, I don't think anybody prepares for such things. So the worldwide pandemic and the murderous war in our region. It's hard to figure out a worse situation in a way, although we are very lucky that we are not in Ukraine. And first of all, my heart and my thoughts are going to all the people there, and of course our friends and all of those who are touched by this horror. I am particularly very proud and very happy that we have you guys, the 15 very resilient people. We all know all the problems we had through the pandemic. One of us, Olena, is from Ukraine. Olena, my heart goes out to you particularly. I am glad that somehow we are on, we are safe. And what is really wonderful is the fact that you guys continued your work, and this thing is going forward in a very impressive manner. And I am now already in the process of immersing myself in the products that you already posted online, as I will need to write something about all of this. So the person we are hosting today, or who is with us, Professor Cas Mudde, is a very central figure in all of this. Cas, I'm trying to remember, it was like 2006, 2005, 2006, an academic year. We wrote together a grant, and we were very lucky to get a grant. So Cas came to Rutgers, and we kept working sort of side by side, but I was not then really that much into far right, although I was very interested, and it was kind of rubbing off on me step by step quite clearly. And Cas produced a very important book during that state, which was published under the title Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe. It was published by Cambridge. In a way which I, to a degree, a little bit regret that I didn't use more this, we didn't talk more about this, that I wasn't more into what he was doing. But eventually it started growing on me. Also because Cas was the co-founder and the leading person in the European Consortium for Political Research, standing group on extremism in democracy. And around the time I started reading that stuff, it started dawning on me that something really important and dangerous is beginning to grow, in a way like a cancer of sorts. So then I started, studying this stuff more, and you cannot help when you study this stuff. You have Cas Mudde all over the place. And I'm not going to go through all the titles. I teach a seminar every semester now on the rise of right-wing politics and right-wing populism in general, And the basic reading is Populism, a very short introduction, which the students really like a lot, which was co-written by Cas and Cristobal Rovira Caldwasser. Then the next book, 2019, was The Far Right Today. I'm assuming we all know this book, but it's very important, very clear a statement on that helps enormously on the side of definitions and analytical clarity. At the moment, Cas is the professor at the University of Georgia's School of Public and International Affairs. He is a very prolific commentator. Actually, a book, Far Right in America, he studies not only Europe, but also looks at what's going on around him, is a collection of essays from various publications in which I very quickly looked again in the introduction, and you say, we should get out of the academia and we should get a little bit more involved in what's going on, because it is very, very important and troubling what's going on around us. For those of you who are in England, you may encounter this sort of academic activism or his persona as a public intellectual in the columns produced for The Guardian. So the format is like we will talk for about 45 minutes, then we will open the floor for the questions and comments. So the whole thing will last about 1 hour, 30 minutes. So welcome, Cas. Great honor, great fun to have you with us. Thank you for finding time for us. And yeah, we kind of shared the very basic ideas of what we can talk about, and we thought we would talk about like the big, important, basic stuff. So hard to find certainly for me, a better person to talk about this stuff after several years actually of digging into various details and trying to figure out what it is all about. Let's try to look at the bigger picture again. So you are one of the people who are the fathers, the grandfathers, whatever, some very founders, co-founders of a subfield on the study of populism, right-wing populism and far right. What are, in your mind, the greatest accomplishments of this field, and what are still the outstanding problems that we still need to work on more?
Okay, thanks, Jan, and hello to everyone in Prague. It's exciting to be here. I really like the project. I like the investment in young scholars. I like the investment in young scholars outside of Anglo academia as well. That generally helps the heterogeneity of the study. Now, before I answer that question, I want to say two things. First of all, what Jan kind of leaves out a bit is the fact that actually, when he reached out to me in 2005, I was a very much a junior scholar, not very well known, and it was incredibly important that Jan took that initiative for me, brought me over to the US, where I had no contacts, and so I'm forever grateful for that. Also, I had come to Jan's work when I did. So I did my PhD and my MA all on the far right in Western Europe. And I moved for professional, personal reasons to Budapest, where I worked at Central European University for a few years. But at that time, I did a lot of work on democratization together with my good friend Petr Kopecký, who's now back in Leiden. And so we read Jan's book with Grzegorz Ekiert, and that had a profound effect on me on rethinking protest, I guess, in general, seeing it not only as problematic or from the margins, but also more at the heart of participatory democracy. In a sense, And the other thing that I think I took from that, but only later, was Jan's focus on culture, culture and memory. And so I was trained as, in a sense, what was at that point in time seen as a reasonably positivist, even though I was never quantitative. I'm a product of the University of Leiden, comparative politics. My supervisor was the late and great Peter Mayer. And so this was a tradition of Mayer, of Daalder. We focused on political parties, but we studied them within the broader context. It was important that you knew what you were talking about, you knew individual countries, but at the same time, we had some type of positivist understanding of like what was evidence, which meant that we generally stayed away from things like culture or memory if we couldn't measure it, right? If it was beyond the survey in a sense. And so talking a lot during that time with Jan, and particularly like about the symbolics of solidarity, for example, the memory of solidarity, but also still vividly remember the importance of how contemporary movements at that point in time, Samoborona, used, in a sense, the legacy and the memory and reshaped to a certain extent of solidarity. I think that had a profound effect on me thinking broader about politics, which to a certain extent is much more visible in my work on populism than in my work on the radical right, which tends to be much more parties focused. The second thing is that I reluctantly accept that I'm one of the founding fathers of modern populism studies. To me, everything goes back to Margaret Canavan. I think Margaret was an amazing scholar, an amazing thinker. And of course, as a political theorist, she was generally a bit broader, vaguer. And so I still think that my definition is very much kind of a translation into more mainstream political science of her understanding of populism. And related to that is, I haven't really followed much of what has been written on populism over the last couple of years, partly because I've just been in survival mode during COVID. I can afford that being a senior scholar. I also have young children, I have other things to do. But also, as we'll talk about later, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the contemporary literature on populism. And so that brings me to the question. And actually, Jan sent me, I think, 6 questions before, and I actually have to prepare a little bit, which I rarely do, but the questions were pretty challenging. So I think the major accomplishment of populism studies, let's say modern populism studies, is, in a sense, it's mainstreaming. It has become a part of mainstream political science for sure, but even sociology and some other fields. I would think that is in part because of the ideational approach, particularly not necessarily because of understanding populism as an ideology, but I think it is simpler. I mean, the definition is pretty straightforward. It's easier than the Laclauian approach. Like for many people who work in the mainstream of social sciences, Laclau's work and Mouffe's work is difficult to deal with. And I myself have that. Like I read Laclau as a graduate student, his 76 book, and I didn't understand anything, literally anything. And even later, I still, and even now, I still really struggle with some of the work. Not necessarily with what they argue. I just don't fully understand what they argue, because it is a different language that they speak than what mainstream social science speaks, right? And so I think that one of the reasons why my definition is so popular is because I come from the mainstream, and to a certain extent I translated people a little bit outside of the mainstream, like Margaret Canavan, to the mainstream. Now, I also think that the major problems that populism studies faces have to do with the fact that it has been mainstream. So let me explain that a bit. I mean, obviously, the big accomplishments and I would say positives about being mainstream is that there are many more resources and scholars now working on populism. Right? There's just far more available. Populism in the 80s, 90s was a marginal field. It was very hard to publish on that in mainstream journals. In fact, one of the reasons I sent my 2004 article, The Populist Zeitgeist, to government and opposition was because it was one of the few that ever published pieces on it. Now you have, like, when I co-edited the EJPR, I think almost 1/3 of all submissions were on populism / radical right / Euroscepticism. Like 1/3, that's insane. We have now, I think, 3 different journals specifically on populism, leaving aside book series, etc. Right? We have hundreds of people writing MA theses and PhD theses about populism, and so I think that's in itself good. It leads to an increased scope of research on populism and depth, which again I think is very good to me as a comparativist. These are building blocks. Like comparativists can't do much without specialized knowledge, and we were lacking it. And that means that a lot of our knowledge was based on a few cases, as was always the problem with the radical right too. But I think it's a problem in general. Like much of the research we have on social democracy is based on Britain and Germany. Right? It's always the big countries that have disproportionate effect. And so now having a much broader scope, also geographically, and much more in-depth studies is good. Also think a theoretical integration into mainstream political science and social science is useful. What you often have is new fields try to reinvent the wheel, but most things about a new phenomenon are actually not specific to that phenomenon and are therefore not new, and can be explained by things that we already have for other things. And so I think all of those are important strengths. Now, the weaknesses or the problems with it is that, as so often, it's not really integration. It's assimilation. I think populism studies is increasingly absorbed by mainstream political science, which is my field and I'm much more familiar with. And as a consequence, it's molded into the relatively narrow kind of approaches that mainstream political science rewards. I think a major problem is the conflation of populism with all kinds of things. I mean, populism became the buzzword of the 21st century. If you wanted to publish something, you put populism on it. But as a consequence, what we see is that quite often people are actually writing, for example, about nativism or about the radical right, but they call it populism. Or they write about protest and they call it populism. Or write about anti-establishment sentiment and they call populism. Now, obviously, they all overlap, but they're not the same. And this conflation is creating a lot of problems. Like, I mean, there are a lot of studies that claim, for example, that rising immigration explains the rise of populism. That is not true as a statement. It explains the rise of right-wing populism. There is no logical reason why it would explain in most cases, the rise of left-wing populism. Why? Because it's not directly connected to populism, it's directly connected to nativism. And nativism is only part of right-wing populism, not left-wing populism. So I find this conflation highly problematic. There are political reasons why I have an issue with that as well. And so I'm not sure whether you know the book by Aurelia Mondon and Aaron Winter, but they by and large critique a lot of the use of populism because it's used as a euphemism for far right. And that has major political issues, right? But there's also a purely academic issue. And finally, I think what a big price is that we pay for the mainstreaming of populism studies is it leads to the marginalization of non-mainstream scholars of populism. And so again, like, I mean, for me, this is all fine because I'm one of those mainstream people who has pretty much written the definition that mainstream people use, right? So my citations go up. But obviously, I have profited from a lot of work of people who were outside of that mainstream. And I see that many of these people are being more marginalized because they do type of work that is not easily translated into a positivistic kind of quantitative approach to political science. So I think those are some of the things. If I think about it way broader, I think probably the debate about populism has led a more of a focus on the debate about liberal democracy than the radical right ever did. Because most of the study of the radical right until, let's say, the 2010s was about parties, was about elections, and didn't really go to the system as such. It was kind of an external threat to the system. The debate about populism is much more within the context of liberal democracy, and as a consequence has led us to ask questions about the state of liberal democracy that we haven't asked before. And so I think that is pretty fundamental. I feel that that is a little bit lost as a part of that mainstreaming again, but it is a very different focus, and of course, I mean, it's a crucial question. I think you're muted.
I'm muted. You're muted. I love saying this thing, and now I have to hear it. So this is something that we deliberately try to avoid very much, I think, also because our conversations with you, because those are the thoughts that you started sharing with us already at the outset of the project where we are shaping it. So we definitely try to achieve, it's very hard, as we know, some kind of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach. We may end up only with interdisciplinary sort of bits and pieces. We will try to put it all together, but it is not easy because the way, for example, I'm trying to do it now. So the create a framing theory for all of this is exactly as you're saying. You have to go beyond the theories that are somehow dominant in the more positivistic modes of thinking in political science. That's pretty clear to all of us. So we're in the project, so we're trying to do that. But what happened with your definition, right, which clearly is the dominant definition, and actually sometimes I'm very tired of people who start articles. Populism is a very difficult concept, and we have we don't know what it is. I just I don't have any hair, so it's not falling out anymore, but it would have been falling out because we do have definitions, and you and your colleagues, not all of them are your definitions, ideational definitions, but the others also sort of tighten their definitions as a strategy or as a style. They are usable. Again, yours seems, is clearly most often used. So I would like to ask you about this definition, right? What is, like, now, after several years, what is your what do you think about this definition? How do you think it fared? What should be added to it, maybe changed? What are its positives and negatives, things like that? It definitely brings ideas to political science, which of course in comparative politics existed before. But, I would say one thing each time I, over the years, would go to the meeting with my colleagues in comparative politics who are talking about ideas, and there's quite a bit of it, including political economists. I've been to several events like that. But when I suggest that we may want to think about it a little bit more broadly, which would mean using more the concept of culture than not just ideas, the whole discussion shuts down. I never managed to go beyond. It's just ideas, but a little bit more complex thinking about culture. We don't know. It's kind of strange stuff. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so again, I come to ideas from a more mainstream, empirical, yet qualitative approach. So my PhD was on the ideology of the extreme right, and so I studied empirically party ideology. And one of the most remarkable things, even today, but definitely at that point in time, is that pretty much the only ones who wrote about ideologies, were political theorists who wrote about them in the abstract, right? And then some political scientists would acknowledge that political parties had ideas, but particularly at that point in time, which was heavy on the rational choice theory, these were kind of considered as distractions. They were not real, right? In the end, everyone was rational choice and would just do what was best for them. There were virtually no studies of party ideologies. And so I've always been interested in practical ideologies rather than just the floating ideas. I've become a bit more interested in things like liberal hegemony and stuff like that. But I don't like things to just float. Like, I mean, they are being translated by political actors. And so I guess that's the reason why I came to populism as an ideology more than a style. Now, I think the strength of my definition is the fact that it is clear, relatively short. It can travel, as they say in comparative politics. It's not bound to one geographical area or even time period. And I think it is distinctive if applied properly. Now, that's where the weakness comes in. So the main weakness, in a sense, is there's an immense aversion against the term ideology. And there is this, both from the left, like this Marxist aversion of ideology, to the right, which is more this kind of like rational choicey type. And so there is a very specific idea among many people about what ideology is. And there can only be a few who have that. And so there's a lot of critique of the definition that I think is completely secondary, is almost irrelevant for all research that people do. And it's purely because it says ideology, right? If I would have said ideas, it would already have fewer critique. I think another thing is that the weakness is that if it is mostly applied pretty broadly, loosely, I would say. So for me, the essence of populism is monism and moralism. Like, if you do not perceive the people and the elite as homogeneous, and you don't see the major distinction conflict as a moral conflict, right? Then you're not talking about populism in my idea. And I think what the consequence of that is, if you don't do that, is that it's not distinctive anymore. And so I see a lot of applications of my definition which don't emphasize moralism, for example, or monism, who just say, well, if you speak about the distinction between the people and the elite, right? Yeah, I mean, almost everyone does, right? I mean, and I don't think that, to me, that's not a major problem of the definition. It's like it's not using the definition well. I think where the definition really struggles is in operationalizing it at the mass level. And so I've been involved in making surveys with questions. And I've developed several of these questions myself. The problem is, I think the indicators are actually good, like in the sense that they measure theoretically what the concept holds. The problem is, for your average person, it sounds like democracy, because the subtleties don't travel well in surveys. We all know that, right? And so I think this is the key reason why we find such massive, seriously, like massive percentages of people who are populist according to surveys. And so this is the reason why we actually included measuring elitism and pluralism, because they are theoretically the opposites of my understanding of populism. And so the idea was, well, we are going to get 80% that are populist according to our scale. We can bring that back by seeing whether people are also pluralist and elitist. And if they also answer that, then we throw them out. Then they're not really populist. But of course, that assumes that people are being consistent, like coherent in their ideas, and people are not. So I think that's a major issue. Now, is that overcome by others? Not necessarily. I mean, the biggest advantage that the ideational approach had, particularly over the approach of Kurt Wayland and others as a mobilization style, is that as such it only exists at the supply level. Right? And for me, politics is always demand and supply. And so to me, that never worked. Now, when you look at the discursive Laclauian approach, that tended to be abstract. But recently, Ben Moffitt wrote an interesting book for polity, where what he by and large just does is think through the discursive approach and look at what people have done with the ideational approach and say, we can do this too with the discursive approach. And I think that's true. Right? And now, whether things should be added or not, this might sound odd, but I'm not particularly invested in this. And don't get me wrong, this is very easy for me to say. Like, I got shit tons of citations on this. Anyone who writes something is going to attack my definition and cite me again. So like, it's all good, right? I just think that we waste massive amounts of time on this type of definitional issues. As I said, every article is, well, we don't have a definition, we don't have a consensus on it. No, we don't have a consensus on anything. Right? That's not, populism isn't very clearly defined, but it's more clearly defined than democracy, than conservatism, than all kind of other key concepts in political science, right? And so we don't need a consensus, right? We actually need different approaches. But what kind of annoys me is that there is this assumption that there are massive differences between the actual work of the different approaches. Whereas I regularly read work by people who have a discursive approach, like Yanis Stavrakakis and his work on anti-populism, which completely is in line with what I would do if I would study. right? So concretely, in most cases of our research, it doesn't matter whether you see populism as an ideology or a style. You will do exactly the same research, whether it's an ideology or a discourse. It will be exactly the same study. It is only for a relatively small portion of work that this has fundamental differences, right? And so in that sense, I'm not saying like we should all stop it and just use mine. No, I mean, feel free to go and make a different definition that works for you, but don't act as if it's that big. Now, final point, and I talk way too much, but this of course all has to do also with the political economy of academia, right? We all have to pretend that what we do is earth-shattering and will completely change the world. Otherwise, we can't be published in a major journal. And of course, that's bullshit, because first of all, we won't learn much if every 2 weeks someone reinvents like the world. But this incentive, which is very strong in US academia, and of course, US academia being so hegemonic, is becoming more and more important to European journals as well. Like it forces authors to make far bigger claims than they can actually back up. And I think actually in quite a lot of cases, they know this, right? And ironically, it makes the articles weaker because they're forced to make claims like that go beyond what they can actually do. And that creates this idea that we just have completely different types of populism research. But I'm very inspired by Chantal Mouffe, right? Not necessarily on her idea about left-wing populism, because I think there's a significant idea difference in how we see it, but her interpretation of liberal democracy and the crisis of it, like, is completely the same as mine. And obviously she was decades before me, right? It was just, I was ignorant and didn't read her until later. And so there are not two different worlds. Like a lot of what we do with partly different definitions is very similar.
Again, thank you so much. I mean, a lot of what you said is we try to implement and try to be mindful of the things that you're saying. When the beginning, all the things you said, I was just jumping up and down with happiness, because I keep telling wherever I can, if you see someone talking about the people and the elite, this is not populism. Just yesterday, I had a graduate student who came for consultation, and she presented her ideas because she's writing about grassroots mobilization. And someone told her, well, your project is on populism. I almost fell off my chair. I said, she's never read a single work on populism yet, right? So I gave her, started with your work and stuff like that. But anyway, I've noticed that you worked earlier with Luke March, and I think his idea on simply don't call it populist, call it demoticism. That's enough. It's a necessary but insufficient condition for the emergence of populism as a phenomenon, ideological phenomenon. And I think what is so incredibly important about your definition, certainly I dwell on this all the time, and a lot of people in the project, we talk about it a lot, is that to the idea of monism and antagonism between the two and monistic entities, which is very important to figure out how they define that monism, which in practice, of course, is very difficult to sort of use and implement, but you add those two additional elements and people completely forget about it. Manichaeism, I love that you use this word. I mean, this is, when you look at the rhetoric of many of those more populistic politicians, they do go into this highly charged language of the struggle of the forces of good and the forces of evil. And then that almost nobody remembers that you have volonté générale there, right? Which is also the idea that basically intermediary institutions do not matter that much, because you somehow mysteriously, but they sort of at least pretend to believe in it, they find a way to gauge the expression of what the people want. And I learned all of this from your definition. So yes, this, if you take all those elements together, it is a pretty well-defined concept. I'm completely agreeing with you that it is perhaps, and I spent years also trying to figure out what democracy is. It is better defined, and certainly conservatives. I love this example. It's that, yeah, I recently started collecting definitions of conservatism. You know, it's even more depressing than anything else, right? To try to figure out what it really is. Yeah, since we are already basically coming, this is so great that we can talk, but we are already at close to 40. Well, we started a little bit late, so we have a little bit, maybe one question at least, maybe two. So what we did in the project, we also both projects actually, in Fatigue and in Pop Rebel, we invited to cooperation people from cultural studies. So we have people writing about the arts, visual arts, theater, all the way to economists who are more political economists. Therefore, you know, that little change opens them to the question, the problem, which is huge for us and central, which is the embeddedness of economic activity, right? Political economists pay attention to political, social, cultural, sometimes even context of economic activity. So we have it in the project. And you know, as you know, one kind of a most clear and certainly very influential questions is it economy or culture, right? In terms when you go to explanations. So can you talk a little bit about that? How you see this relationship, and even, you know, I tend to think that this is economy, politics, so society, and cultures, like four grand areas. But if we stick only to culture and economy, what is your thinking about it? Is it a useful thing to put it in those terms, or how would you talk about it?
Okay, so I must preface this by saying that I've almost never really done much work on theories and on trying to explain things, particularly not general phenomena, because again, I'm mostly interested in practical things, and so I'm mostly interested in political parties, because I believe that those are the most important for what happens in countries. And while general theories are useful, they only they give you a very small part of the actual answer of why party A gets to power or stays in power or things like that, right? Now, I think that, I still strongly believe that people start to vote for populists because they're unhappy, like not because they're happy. Now, we have to, this is start to vote, because at the same time, we do see that there are actually populist regimes can be very popular, as we see in Poland and in Hungary. And these people do not necessarily vote because they're unhappy. In those cases, some of the people are actually happy with what the regime provides compared to what they believe the opposition used to provide. Now, we can have discussions about like whether this is false consciousness and whatever. That's irrelevant to me. They don't vote purely out of protest. I'm not very convinced about economic anxiety. The numbers are simply too high. And if it is true, the interesting thing is, if you look actually at surveys, you see that rich people are more concerned about money than not the poorest, but people just above that, the people that we actually all the time think about it. And so economic anxiety is often interpreted as that you have little money. But actually, anxiety, of course, is an emotion, right? So economic anxiety would presuppose that you're concerned about the economic state. Turns out that is not class related. Now, I think in that sense, economic anxiety plays a role, but most studies, at least of the right-wing populism, shows that people who vote for right-wing populists are not so much concerned about their own economic situation, but that of the country. Now, then the question is chicken and egg, right? Why are they so concerned? And my answer always is, if I would think, if I'm a racist, to keep it very simple, right? And I think that non-Dutch people are lazy, criminal, inefficient, etc. And at the same time, I think that there is a huge amount of these people in my country. I would get pessimistic about the state of the economy, right? We have a lot of lazy and moochers, right? So what is driving what? And to be honest, I think the economic anxiety is a product, not so much of economics, but of other ideologies. I think the most understudied aspect is culture. Before I go, let me say something about the economy. So I don't understand economics very much, and that is probably why I just focus mostly on the ideas of it. Wolfgang Streeck has written a lot of stuff, and he's a economic sociologist, German, deeply Marxist, and I disagree with much of what he writes, particularly his historical determinism. But he has written about neoliberalism as an ideology rather than economic system. And just like others, I'm totally convinced that neoliberalism as an ideology has been far more successful than neoliberalism as an economic system. And there are similarities between neoliberalism claims and populist claims. Most importantly, it is the complete abdication of responsibility of the citizen. And so in neoliberalism, the client is king, right? And the client in democracy is the voter. And it is up to the politicians, who are the producers of products, right, to provide the products that the customer wants. So it's up to the politicians to provide what people want, right? Which means that people are not responsible for anything. And I think there is a very important ideological connection in that sense between neoliberalism and the rise of populism, which is not economic. Right? The other link and that's why I call populism an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. The other aspect of neoliberalism is, to a certain extent, systemic, but again, it also has a very important psychological, I would say, element, and that is neoliberalism has just shrunk the democratic space, and it's created an atmosphere, an illusion of lack of power, lack of options. And that's frustrating, right? And populists claim that everything is in their hands. Now, the reality is in the middle. Like, I think that we dismiss populist claims far too easy. A lot of the things that they say they will do are doable. The point is, often the price is far too high, right? But you can get out of the EU. The UK has shown it. Should you? That's not so much the question. The point is that politicians have been saying for decades, you can't do this, you can't do that, right? As if it's a non-political question, as if it's outside of the hands of the people. And that is a very problematic aspect from a democratic point of view. And this is what the populists have profited from bringing it back. Now, culture is actually a completely ignored part, I think, of the populist zeitgeist. But I actually make a point there, because the zeitgeist is not so much in terms of political program. At least that's not what I foresaw in 2004. And Matthijs Rodin, in his PhD, showed that it didn't have much effect. For me, the populist zeitgeist was culture, was political culture. It was the fact that when we talked about politics, we no longer have a stuffy professor sitting in the studio explaining what is happening, but you have a journalist in the middle of a street asking the men in the street about what is happening, and then asking a politician to respond to that person as if that person just told the truth, right? It is about our fascination with common people, which is what I saw in Big Brother, a show that came from my country, the Netherlands. And I was thinking, would that show ever have been popular in the 60s, 50s? No. In the 50s, 60s, we didn't watch common people. We watched special people. Like, and so to me, culture plays a major role. And this is something that I've become very interested in. I haven't done too much studies in, but my example is always, and you're not American, so you might not have seen it, but there's this movie called Sweet Home Alabama, which is just an absolutely common love story, Reese Witherspoon, but it actually is a perfect capture of the populist spirit of the US. So what happens? Reese Witherspoon is just your average girl, like of course white and blonde, who grows up in a small town, real America, and falls in love with her high school boyfriend, gets married, but then kind of wants more. Goes to the city, which is New York always, right? There's only one city in America. And there gets involved with a politician and becomes corrupted. Now forgets what's really important in life and starts to want all kinds of things that are really not important. She comes back to the small town to get a divorce and kind of gets rekindled with like purity, like what is really essential. I mean, it's beautiful. It's like the most beautiful populist message. And of course, no one recognizes it as such, because this is what common culture is in the US. US common culture is very populist, unlike most European cultures. And so analyzing music, like there's some beautiful populist messages in music, particularly country music. Think about Johnny Cash, but also some others. Like think about how TV shows are being crafted, movies. And so I think there's a lot there. Now, where that fits in, does it explain, to me, in that sense, Gramscian approach, right? The cultural change comes before the political change. And I do see that as well. Like it is that shift that made Pin for 10 possible in the early 2000s.
Thank you again. Great, very important thoughts, and very. I hear a lot of support for quite a few things we are trying to do. We have very quickly, and then we'll move to the questions maybe, that we have ethnographers in the project. Also, I see, and I'm very happy, some of our Pop Rebel ethnographers online. So we are trying to go beyond the problem you mentioned earlier of the poverty of survey generated information. And we have our economists are working with the concept, not with the concept of inequality, but geez, I forgot the concept. Not anxiety. What is the concept we have?
Insecurity.
Insecurity. Thank you. Insecurity, yes, which is very much related to what you had, which was anxiety. And yes, the neoliberalism as an ideology, I don't know if you know, there's this great book on resilience edited by Peter Hall and Lamont, and there is a chapter there written by Peter Evans and Sewell, in which they talk about neoliberalism as four different things, and one of them is it is an economic ideology, but it is also an economic practice, but it is also social-cultural ideology, almost exactly the way you talked about it. So for us, this is also very important, that you described that mechanism. I saw it in some of your writing, that's a very important kind of relationship between neoliberalism as an ideology and the reaction to it in the forms of rising sympathy for at least some populist themes. So